Hi, thank you for joining me for my 5-minute Bible study today. We continue in the book of Colossians. We are in chapter 2 and we are in verse 10. As always, it's so important for us to have the context of what we're reading, and today that's very much true as well. So if you can, go ahead and read verses 8 through 15 so you fully understand what Paul's talking about in verse 10. Now let's take a look at verse 10. It says this: "And in him you have been made complete, and he is the head over all rule and authority." So as we look at that, we recognize this verse is kind of broken up into two parts. So let's look at the second part first, because I want to spend some more time on the first part than the second. But I don't want to ignore the second part. So let's take a look at it really quickly. It says that he is head over all rule and authority. And we've heard that before. Where have we heard that? It was back in chapter 1. And verse 16, we recognize that Jesus is the creator God, the one who created all rulers and authorities. And so here, you see that Jesus is head over all rule and authority. We're going to see this again in verse 15 as Paul talks about rulers and authorities. What's Paul saying here in verse 10? Well, he could be saying that he is the one who created all rule and authority, all the whole spirit realm. If you remember, that's what the rules and authority are: the angels, the demons, Satan himself. Jesus created them. He's the creator of God. But here it's speaking more of being the authority over the spiritual realm and all demons, all angels, Satan himself. And so we recognize that. And why does Paul mention that? Because back in verse 8, remember, Paul's telling us that we need to be careful of who we're paying attention to. We need to watch that we're not listening to the philosophies that are false, the philosophies of men, and the philosophies of men that come from Satan and demons. Instead, we need to only pay attention to the philosophies that are according to Christ. And so Paul's telling us here in verse 10 to be careful of that, but he's saying specifically that Jesus is over that. Now, getting back to the beginning of this verse, he says, "In him you have been made complete." And that's really an interesting part of the verse, because it's pointing us back to verse 8 and 9. Remember, back in verse 8, we only are going to pay attention to philosophies that are according to Christ. And in verse 9, why? Because the fullness of God is in Christ. So there's nothing else that we need. And so then in verse 10, "And we are made complete in Christ." Paul's doing something interesting with the wording here. The wording is the fullness of God is in Christ. That is a noun. The fullness of God, it's a noun. And here we are made complete. It's a verb. In the Greek, same words. One's the verb form and one's the noun form of the same word. This idea of being complete, this idea of being of fullness. And so in Christ, we are made complete. We have the fullness. Now, Paul's not saying that we become God. He is saying that Jesus has the fullness of God. We are saying that Jesus, therefore, is God. But we're not saying that because we are made complete in Christ that we are now gods. There are some beliefs, religions that believe that. We call them cults. We don't believe that. We don't become God. We will never be God. We are always finite beings. But here, Paul says that we have been made complete in Christ. And what's he saying there? Well, what he's saying is that in Christ, we are complete in our spiritual walk. There is nothing more that we need to know about God. There is nothing more that we need to experience about God that we don't have in Christ. In Christ, we have everything we need to know God, to experience God, to be in a relationship with God. And so we are complete. Now, a lot of churches today will disagree. A lot of pastors and teachers today will disagree. They'll say that there's something more that we need than just Jesus. Oh, it's good you have Jesus, but you also need to go to church. You also need to tithe your money. You also need to listen to this person or this teacher. You also need something else, another person, something else in addition to Jesus. And Paul's telling us no. He's telling us straight out that all we need is Christ. And that's why back in John John chapter 14, Philip says to Jesus, "But Lord, just show us the Father and we'll be happy." And Jesus says, "Don't you know that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father? Because I am the fullness of God, and anything that you need, you have in me." And so that is what Paul's saying. He's saying the same thing that Jesus said back in John chapter 14. He's saying that the fullness of God is in Christ, and we are complete in him. So with that, thank you so much for joining me for verse 10. Tomorrow we'll go ahead into verse 11. If you have any questions, or in fact, any comments whatsoever about what we heard today, please go ahead and put them in the comments, and I'll be happy to get back to you as soon as I can. Until that time, thanks for being with me today. We're looking forward to being with you again tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you.